Okay, can you hear me? Is the sound coming through? Okay, right. Okay, great. Um, well, thank you all for coming. Um, Friends, family, people I don't know. Um, and thanks to Matilda and the organizers of the Oxford Climate Society for organizing this event. I'm really grateful to be giving this lecture and to be doing so with Zoe. Today, I'm going to speak a bit about my experience journeying from maths through ecology to geography, and then I'll talk a little bit about the value that I've found as a mathematician and scientist working to address the climate and biodiversity crisis in engaging with Indigenous scholars and ways of knowing. My presentation is going to be a bit more about stepping back and thinking than showing you lots of graphs and slides. And I'll aim to speak for about 25-ish minutes. Then Zoe will give her presentation, and Zoe and I will conclude with a brief exchange between the two of us. Okay, let me upload my slides. Okay, um, are the slides? Oh, hello, Sammy, and everybody else. Thank you for coming. Um, are the slides visible? Great. Okay, we can start with um, okay, it doesn't have the animation, so don't worry about trying to read all the text. But to start off with a working definition of maths, maths is it's a precise way of working with patterns, concepts, relationships, and sometimes, but not always, numbers. Maths is pretty central in environmental research. Its uses range from modeling plant population dynamics to predicting patterns of animal movement, from formulating theories of island biogeography to measuring metabolisms of tropical forests. After training in maths, I began a PhD, started about 5 or 6 years ago, began a PhD in ecology, working to study the spatial distributions of wildcats in Southeast Asia and studying the movement behavior of lions in southern Central Africa. Now, um, my primary motivation was, and still is, to make a positive change in the world. But as my PhD got underway, it occurred to me, how can I positively change the world if I don't deeply know the world in the first place? In particular, as I started to read texts by and speak with Indigenous scholars, geographers, anthropologists, I began to wonder, how can I make sure that my mathematical and scientific models are not contributing to or reproducing the roots of the present environmental crisis? I'll give two examples that started to raise these questions for me. So during the middle of my PhD, I worked with the concept of landscape connectivity, now a major field of research in ecology, which looks to understand and predict how animals move through a landscape. Here is an image from CircuitScape, perhaps the most popular connectivity model in theoretical and applied research. It's also widely used by land managers and governments worldwide in conservation decision making. CircuitScape draws on the physical theory of electrical circuits to model animals as an electrical current flowing through a giant circuit which represents the landscape. Now, as with many animal movement models, circuits, the algorithm assumes that the animal is a machine lacking any agency or creativity that navigates its environment according only to a cost benefit logic of resource extraction. Yet the authors of Circuitscape conclude their paper by saying that we find that the method objectively identifies important elements similar to those identified by the human eye, replicating expert opinion, but removing potential sources of bias. Now, a physics-based methodology is one thing, but I think this quote is striking because it closes the gap between model and world, affirming and foregrounding that which fits the lineaments of physics, and implicitly but actively brushing aside that which is difficult to measure with existing mathematical methods from the physical sciences. Here's one more example from a chapter authored by two influential mathematical biologists in the seminal textbook Theoretical Ecology. The authors describe a framework for understanding how animal populations cooperate, based on the prisoner's dilemma thought experiment from game theory, in which, if both animals defect, they receive the punishment P. If one cooperates and the other defects, then the cooperator receives the sucker's payoff, S, while the defector receives the temptation, T. They then formulate this mathematically, and through the laws and logics of maths deduce that cheats receive better payoffs than cooperators. And then the authors conclude their paper by saying, these rules represent laws of nature governing the natural selection of cooperation. But when I read this, I wondered, like, am I really learning about laws of nature, or is this just a projection of human behavioral economics? These are just two examples in ecology, but they occupy a central place in the discipline and they're not unique. Although many ecologists would informally say that all models are wrong, but some are useful, the authors that I've quoted in their recourse to objective truth and laws of nature point towards something more systemic, or rather a systematic absence of something. Okay, I'm going to take my slides down for the middle of this talk so that you can see me gesticulate. A classic maths textbook begins by saying that maths, like the other sciences, reflects the laws of the material world around us and serves as a powerful instrument for our knowledge and mastery of nature. This is the assumption of representation. There's a single existing reality, and it's the job of mathematical laws and scientific models to represent, predict, quantify that reality to a greater or lesser degree of complexity. The point that I would like to make now is that models do not just represent a given world, but that models actually make worlds, favoring some realities and eclipsing others. For example, paraphrasing John Law and Marianne Lien here, population models create a reality of populations. Now, that might sound like a truism until one realizes that this can become the primary way in which quantitative researchers, especially, think about other people in faraway countries, particularly in global environmental discourse. Now, this enables certain statements to be made, such as one that I recently heard from a university professor, a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, no less, who said, and I quote, "India has too many people, they need to eliminate some of their population." But I had just come back to the UK from India, where I'd spent some time living and working with Indigenous communities in Ladakh in the high Himalaya. Now, sure, the village families often had more children, maybe 7 or 8, compared with the so-called modern families in the cities, who had maybe 2 or 3 children. But the social relations in the villages were such that families typically pooled their efforts and resources and shared one water source and tended one vegetable garden. They were often also very healthy. Whereas in the city, the sons in the families would often try to build their own hotels on separate plots of land, using different food supplies and separate boring holes for water extraction. the result being that the environmental toll was actually much greater for the smaller families in the cities than the larger families in the villages. Now, the story is complex, but the key point is that a world constituted by discrete populations is a world where social relations are either secondary or absent. Now, it's not quite sufficient to say that the viewpoint of social relations and the viewpoint of discrete populations are simply two perspectives on the same world, as if we can agree that the world is a given, but we just have different opinions on it. This is because, as Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts or physicists Neil Bohr and Karen Barad might say, your perspective on reality and what reality is to you are inseparable. If you want to get geeky about it, this is saying that epistemology, how you know reality, and ontology, what reality you know, are entangled. Now, the important point is not the big words themselves, but rather they direct attention to what realities are being made and how. Here's another example. Consider the idea of the natural environment. In her beautiful master's thesis, The Ecology of Possession, Kira Long draws on Kyle White, Kim Tauber, and John Law to describe how the biodiverse and resource-rich landscapes encountered by settlers in North America were lush because of indigenous peoples. The wild rice bed, perhaps a natural feature in the settler imagination, is part of a Menominee ecology, Menominee being an indigenous nation here, is part of a Menominee ecology governed through seasonal rice camps and community distributed roles and responsibilities. Clearing the wild rice beds to make way for the settler model of the environment removes more than just the physical rice beds. As Kyle White says, the lack of visibility of wild rice beds and the indigenous communities who monitor and protect them further solidifies the presumption that indigenous peoples are absent. In other words, how an environment is conceptualized and modeled affects how it's managed in practice. And over time, this alters the physical characteristics of the environment to reflect back a particular idea of what's natural that seems to affirm the truth of the model, when in fact, model and environment have shaped each other to include certain realities and exclude others. One sec. So, in the paradigm of representation, there's one world and the model represents it. But taking a cue from Kira Long, Anne-Marie Mole, and others, we could say that models don't so much represent the world as participate and intervene in it, so that what is real for one person may not be so for another. That point is crucial, I think, for doing climate and biodiversity modeling with an awareness of which people's realities are being included and which are being excluded, and thus realizing that no model has the final say, but is always a partial perspective. Some people freak out with the idea that there's not a singular world that you can map and know in totality, believing this means that everything goes, or that we have a flat ontology where everything is relative and there's no political traction. But in my experience, at least, this doesn't really happen. The reason being that the world was never controlled by a singular mode of ordering in the first place. Okay, so maybe we live in a world of many worlds. Does this mean that we now need even more complex and sophisticated mathematical models to somehow capture these multi-dimensional, multiple realities and the feedback loop between model and world? And I don't think so. And the reason why is that the subjects and the objects of ecological knowledge are not separate. This is a key theme throughout the texts by Indigenous scholars that I've engaged with, particularly philosophers such as Vine Deloria Jr. and Eugene Richard Atleo. You can develop the objects of knowledge, your model or theory, and make it as high tech and cutting edge and like state of the art as you like. But if you don't also attend to the subject of knowledge, the figure of the knower, then you can't get very far in learning anything new. For example, I'm just about to submit a paper on topology. Topology is a field of maths designed for studying complex spatial and temporal relationships. Topology is also widespread in geography, and the paper is about connecting topological ideas in geography and in maths to better understand spatial patterns in social and ecological relations. Now, as a mathematician, like the usual approach would be, I'm going to apply maths to geography. However, as one textbook on applied maths begins, much of applied mathematical analysis can be summarized by the observation that we continually attempt to reduce our problems to ones that we already know how to solve. Now, this approach definitely has some value, but the key limitation is that it tries to move the object of study. In this case, ideas of space, it tries to move them from maths to geography while leaving the subject of knowledge and all their views and values unchanged and out of the picture. But because how you know reality and what reality is to you are inseparable, maths reproduces its own way of knowing and its own reality, rather than coming into dialogue with a different way of knowing and a different reality. So that particularly in environmental research, maths can often play a lead role in a cage, to quote Pink Floyd. Thanks to multi-species justice scholar Danny Sellermeyer for that reference. In this paper, we tried something different, to describe topological concepts just as they are in a maths textbook, but to do so in a geographer's way of knowing, in the spatial vocabularies of geography. The result was striking. Suddenly, by changing tongues from mathematician to geographer, mathematical topology suddenly emerged as an unlikely ally to a number of important insights by Indigenous scholars, geographers, and social scientists about space. That space is relational, it's embodied, space has agency. Space is not empty, but it's imbued with life. There's no total view on space from outside, but rather we're immersed corporeally within it. At the same time, however, what happened was that our description of spatial and temporal concepts took on a degree of ambiguity. There were no longer any single right answers or absolute truths. Now, if maths wants to move beyond the curated laboratory setting and bring rigor and precision to messy environmental contexts, then the ambiguity in our analysis could be seen as a technical shortcoming or a failure to define terms clearly. But there's another possibility, and I'm drawing on Law and Atleo here. Could it instead be the case that our approach was highly rigorous and precise, but that we're working with ecological phenomena that require a degree of descriptive indeterminacy to become visible? Worlds that cannot be known if they're rendered fixed and static, like a specimen pinned to a board and labelled. If theoretical ecology's prevailing view of nature, as constituted by mechanical laws of motion and cost-benefit behavioral logics, is not the only reality, but simply one of many, then what could be less rigorous, what could be less precise than insisting that nature must fit the image of Newtonian physics or classical economics, and that anything which doesn't match this vision is explained away as subjective bias or random variation? As Kira Long writes, the perceived conflict between indigenous ways of knowing and scientific practice leads to assumptions that to be an indigenous person working in science means to be stuck moving between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. But, Kira explains, Kim Torber's 2014 study with Native American scientists found that rather than being impeded by incompatible knowledge forms, the native scientists studied were more often challenged by the social differences in the relationship with knowledge that Indigenous communities and scientific communities had. Torber describes the unease these Indigenous scientists felt with the right to know ethos of science, because an acceptance at times of not knowing is part of acting with respect to the inherent sovereignty of other beings, human or non-human. To accept that there are boundaries to what one can know, and that there might be a right time and a right place to know something, can be challenging to a Euro-American science which still carries traces of René Descartes' dictum that European civilization must become the masters and possessors of nature, drawing on the so-called father of modern science, Francis Bacon, who said, "Science should, as it were, torture nature's secrets out of her, and that the empire of man should penetrate and dominate the womb of nature." I'm quoting here from Patel and Moore's book, The History of the World in Seven Cheap Things. Now, alongside this violence, this entitlement to total knowledge is, in my experience at least, highly limited as an approach to knowledge production, because the world reveals only a sliver of its depth to the entitled mind. If I am the one who knows, then I strive to extract and grasp knowledge only in the forms of things that I already think of as knowledge. I look for a mechanism or a rational behavior, or I look for birdsong only in male birds. And I might disregard what is right in front of my eyes, which I cannot recognize because of my own unexamined assumptions. I think that the present climate and ecological crisis is an invitation to researchers to move from being the ones who know to the ones who listen. As the Psyche Guidelines for Scientific Research with the Inuit in Nunavut say, be a human first and a researcher second. Indeed, I once heard David Abrams say that the root of the word human is the same as another word, humility, which is the same as another word, humus, not the chickpea dish, but the soil, the earth. And there's another reason, I think, for cultivating humility in relation to the world. It's that humility and a patience for knowledge to find you when the time is right is a powerful means for realizing that one is not alone in the world. As David Abram writes in Becoming Animal, as soon as we breathe out, letting the mind flow back into the field that surrounds us, we feel a new looseness and freedom. The other animals, the plants, the cliffs, and the tides are now participant in the unfolding of events. And so it no longer falls upon us alone to make things happen as we choose. We're now accomplices in a vast and steadily unfolding mystery, and our actions have resonance only to the extent that they are awake to the other agencies around us, attuned and responsive to the upwelling creativity of the land itself. Okay, my last point I'll make with the slides. One sec. Okay, this takes me to the last point that I'd like to make before concluding, which concerns how environmental knowledge can affect whether one has a meaningful relationship with nature. This is a question of the ethics of knowledge. Ethics not as right or wrong, good or bad, but simply as looking into how theories and models affect the way that one lives, thinks, feels, acts, and relates in the world. There is so much that I would like to discuss here. Um, so much that I'd like to discuss here, but several people have recently told me that I talk too much about ideas and never give enough examples of my scientific work. So here's one from a paper that I've just finished writing with ecologist Kevin Gaston as part of my postdoctorate. Kevin and I undertook a study on how hearing loss can change the way people interact with other species and experience biodiversity, focusing on the possible effects of aging on one's ability to hear birdsong. We chose 10 bird species in the UK, or should I say they chose us: the robin, the goldcrest, the wren, oh wait, they're a bit bigger there. So going from left to right: the robin and the goldcrest, the wren and the blue tit, the wood pigeon, the blackbird, the nightingale, chaffinch, nightingale, cuckoo, and sparrowhawk. We used song recordings from the citizen science repository Xenocanto and looked at the amplitude and frequency spectra of the different bird songs. Then, following a method used by ornithologists Michael Emlen and Robert de Jong, we superposed public health data of age-related hearing loss onto these song spectra. So an example of a frequency amplitude spectrogram from a robin song is on the bottom left, and then taking public health data on hearing loss for different age decades. The graph on the right, in the graph on the right, the difference between the song amplitude and the colorful lines gives a measure of how the perceived loudness of birdsong may change for people of different ages. Don't worry about the text yet. If you look at the graphs on top, I think the results are quite striking. Birds such as the goldcrest or the blue tit, which sing at higher frequencies, may become imperceivable for older listeners, even at a distance of 5 or 10 meters. But there's something else going on too. Because higher frequencies are generally lost with age to a greater degree than lower ones, as Emlen and de Jong write, younger people with good hearing rarely appreciate that deafness generally involves the quality and the richness of bird sounds as much as their loudness. Familiar songs become strange as they lose the high frequencies that give them their character, such as the house wren, whose melodious warble becomes a sewing machine-like rattle. Now, birdsong, sensory perception, and the way that sound travels through a landscape are so subtle and nuanced. So these graphs are not absolute truths, they're not matters of concern. Rather, as Bruno Latour might say, they're not matters of facts, but rather, as Bruno Latour might say, they're matters of concern. A way to highlight how the so-called extinction of nature experience can disproportionately affect those who have significant hearing loss. In particular, because one person may hear the apparently same song very differently to another person, the description of bird calls provided in ecology textbooks and field guides may be meaningful only to those people with high auditory acuity. But this then means that ecology textbooks and field guides are telling you details not of a bird's song in itself, but rather of a relationship between human listener and singing bird. So if there does exist a nature separate from humans, but one which can also be totally mapped and known by humans, then who maps it and who knows it? Whose nature is it that ecology textbooks present? Only people with high sensory acuity? By the time you train as an ecologist and collect field data, you may have already lost the ability to perceive certain songs. And even if you have great hearing, if you're not tuning into other species, but are just thinking about how much you fancy someone or how much honey and cinnamon that you'll add in your porridge in the morning, then from my experience, you don't really hear the dawn chorus. You don't see the robin hopping for your attention on the neighboring beech tree. It seems to me that holding on to a nature which humans can know in totality, but in which they don't belong, is oppressive, whichever way you cut it, and also scientifically flimsy. Does it not make more sense to speak of nature as relational, to speak of the object of ecological knowledge as not separate from the subject, as emphasized by all the Indigenous scholars that I've mentioned today. I'm going to stop there and let Zoe take over, but thanks for listening. And here are some of the key points from the lecture today, in case you want to have a look at the slides afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you, Siddharth, so much for sharing your ecological work and sort of your theorizing of how you're working through these relations. I'm just going to upload some of my slides now and hopefully complement what you just shared. So I'm just hoping this all works. And also just thank you everyone for joining. It's incredible to see how many people are in the room. And I want to thank Siddharth for inviting me and sharing the stage with me. You didn't have to do that, and it was very generous of you to do so. And thank you to Matilda and Rebecca for making sure I could get on screen. So I just want to say hello. My name is Zoe Todd. I am a Red River Métis scholar from Canada. I am from the prairies, which is sort of the west central part of Canada that stretches from the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains all the way to Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba, which are some of our Great Lakes in Canada. And we are interconnected across the prairies through the watersheds that flow from the Rocky Mountains across the plains and connects us with Indigenous nations, other Indigenous nations across that territory, but also connects us to diverse, more than human relations. And so in my work, I'm a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and I work on the interconnections between freshwater fish futures and Indigenous governance and Indigenous sovereignties in Canada. And this work is really urgent in Canada precisely because, as a resource colony, and you've maybe, if you've been watching the news and seeing Canada come up lately, it's largely because Trump is claiming he's going to take over Canada as the 51st state, and also is placing incredible tariffs on a lot of the resources that we ship to the US. We are the number one supplier of oil to the US. We also supply lumber to Asian markets. So a lot of raw materials come from Canada, and those raw materials come from Indigenous homelands. So those include oil and gas, coal, lumber, rare earth minerals as well. So we're interconnected, but also at the same time, Canada is the headquarters of a vast majority of mining companies in the world. And so the violence that is enacted against Indigenous peoples in Canada is also enacted on local and Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, throughout Africa, throughout Southeast Asia, and in other parts of the world, with Canadian complicity. So these are really complex relations, and trying to respond to them ethically and concretely is the work of many, many different people across Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And in trying to protect freshwater fish in my homelands, which is work that I take very seriously and also builds on the work of someone that I consider my mentor, which was my late stepdad, who was also Red River Métis, who was a fisheries scientist who tried very hard to protect fish against all of these environmental catastrophes. It's really hard to find ways through. And so I want to just thank Siddharth for bringing our attention to that reality of our interconnection, because this is really a foundational part of Indigenous relationality. I'm just going to make sure everyone can hear me. I just want to make sure you can all hear me before I launch into my talk. So in doing this work, what I've really come to realize is that it's so important to tend to those interrelations that Siddharth touched on, the reality of the entire universe as interconnected, and that the actions I take in the prairies have reverberations not only where I'm from, but also globally. And that's through political entanglements, through environmental entanglements, social, spiritual, economic, and the physical components of reality. So, all of this is preamble to say that in my own work, trying to find an answer for how to bring people to account for the damage they are doing to watersheds in the prairies, and the vast impact that's having not only on people but on fish, and disproportionately on racialized and Indigenous communities in Canada. I've been looking for kind of guidance from some of the brilliant Indigenous thinkers who came before my generation. And one of those people is Vine Deloria. Siddharth touched on Vine briefly in just before. And Vine Deloria was a really fascinating Dakota thinker who called on settlers to sort of be held accountable for the impact they had on Native American peoples in the US, and by extension also on other Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world as well. And in this work, he really focused on the metaphysics of our engagements. And by metaphysics, I mean that connection of the spiritual and the physical together, that they can't be separate. And what's really fascinating is he also pointed out that that's really not so different from what physics came to belatedly realize 100 years ago about quantum mechanics as well. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet and clear, hopefully, is just what does it mean for me as a Red River Métis person situated in Canada to think through my existence and the existence of my nation, our people, in a wave-based set of relations in prairie watersheds, and what kind of relations does that bring me into on a more global scale. So, as I said, the late Dakota scholar and theologian, he was a religious scholar as well. So he was intimately familiar with the history of sort of Judeo-Christian and European religious histories, very well read in very many different disciplines. And he took a really keen interest in the interrelations of Indigenous metaphysics, so that's spiritual and physical together, and other people's metaphysics and spirituality globally. And this is outlined in many of his works. If you haven't had a chance to read him, he has lots of different ones. The first one he published was Custer Died for Your Sins, which was really sort of like his most popular book he ever wrote. But he also wrote other ones, including The Metaphysics of Modern Existence, God is Red, Power and Place, which he co-authored with Daniel Wildcat, and also The World We Used to Live in. And his mentee, David Wilkins, outlines in the afterword to a 2012 reprint of Metaphysics of Modern Existence that Vine had intended to write a book about the resonances between Indigenous peoples in North America, so the US and Canada, our metaphysics, and Eastern metaphysics. So he was really interested in looking at how diverse non-Western peoples' practices actually are very aligned. But sadly, he passed in 2005 at the age of 72 and never got to finish that book. So all of this is to say, this is what's been bringing me to theorizing Indigenous metaphysics from the prairies, so tending to fish like the one that you see here, alongside work like Thich Nhat Hanh's framings of Zen Buddhism and quantum mechanics together to imagine our ways through and out of the nightmares fomented and created by the European Enlightenment and what Aileen Morton Robinson, who's an Indigenous scholar from Australia, calls white possession. So that desire by white people, using a lot of the logic Siddharth just outlined, like the violence of the idea that Europeans have a right to torture nature's secrets out of her, and to be masters and possessors of science. How do we get out of those? I think that diverse, non-Western, and Indigenous perspectives give us a lot of guidance and like concrete guidance to get out of those sort of like nightmares of white possession and what Karen Brad calls the metaphysics of individualism, this idea that you can break everything down into singular particle tiny bits and pieces, discrete parts that don't interact with one another. And then also just like the unequal capitalist accumulation that we're all kind of contending with today that is destroying the planet. So, Yeah. So what I really find exciting about Vine Deloria's work is that he didn't play the role of kind of like the anthropological indigenous wise elder that was supposed to just sort of make European settlers feel good about themselves and give them little bits of kind of, wisdom that would allow them to continue what they were doing and feel good about it. Instead, he was very critical of colonialism, very critical of Western society. And in the metaphysics of modern existence, he looks really closely at the relationship between Western science, how it understands the world. He points out all the ways that it was wrong about Indigenous peoples, and so he's very critical of that. But he also points out that there are potentials for science and non-Western knowledges to be in a productive conversation with each other. And so I pull this quote here because it's been like rattling around in my brain now for since 2023. And he said in one of the chapters of that book, quote, scientific inquiry has now become part of a larger process of interaction that can only be described as incorporating relationships of personal quality with nature to produce knowledge. So this is the key part I want us to pull out of here. Western science has thus arrived at precisely the starting point of non-Western peoples in apprehending more than physical and mechanical activities in nature. And what he's saying there, as I read it, is he's saying that when Western science, which sees itself, as kind of like the pinnacle of Western society, when it figured out that actually the world is made up of quantum relations that aren't fixed, that are continuously influencing one another, and you can't pin them down because they're interacting in these complex ways. When people like Niels Bohr and Einstein, all these people kind of stumbled upon this realization, they were at the starting point of non-Western peoples. They were reaching the starting point of peoples in the rest of the world. And what I like about this is it completely pushes back on this idea that sort of Europe is the pinnacle of wisdom and everybody else needs to sort of fold themselves into European thought. He's saying, no, 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 we don't need to fold ourselves into anything. Europe, Western science, America, all of these sort of imperial powers, they actually have to catch up to non-Western people and Indigenous people. And this is really powerful because it shifts the conversation entirely. So this goes beyond kind of this idea that Indigenous people need to be kind of like dispensing little tidbits of environmental knowledge to the West and to the global North in order to sort of give liberal democracy the tools it needs to be a little bit better about the environment. It's not that at all. It's actually saying we need to radically reimagine the systems that currently run the world, that run on extraction, that run on environmental destruction, that run on ego, that run on capitalism, and what Aileen Morton Robinson calls white possession. And white possession, what she means is this idea that white people, European colonizers, settlers, imperialists, believe that they have the right to own everything and to fold everyone else into their world. And so this also means that Western institutions are not only catching up to non-Western people, and of course we know like science, Western science draws on African knowledge, it draws on Asian traditions, it draws on Muslim mathematical traditions, like it draws on knowledge from all over the world already, and then it presents it as if it didn't steal that from everyone else. And so not only is Vine Deloria and people who are thinking with him and other anti-imperialist and decolonial scholars, not only are we saying that the West has to catch up to non-Western people, or as Pius Adesamni said, Africa is the forward the rest of the world needs to face. It's also that Western science has to catch up to its own science because it's still, or Western institutions that still kind of operate on those ideas that Newton and Descartes and Locke and others came up with in the 1600s that allowed them to commit such horrific violence across the planet. Those logics don't actually hold even in Western science's own data and calculations anymore. So we actually have to force the West to catch up to its own science. So that's like kind of powerful and provocative. So this also, to me, as an Indigenous person in Canada, which is a country that is committing horrific violences against peoples all over the planet, that is complicit in pollution and mining and human rights violations all over the world, it means Indigenous peoples in Canada have an obligation to global anti-imperialist solidarities and environmental solidarities that not only hold Canada accountable to what it has done to our ancestors and our current communities, but also acknowledges what Canada is complicit in globally. So, yeah, maybe I'm going to skip some stuff because I think I'm taking a little longer than I meant to. But in the prairies, like we also saw ourselves as a wave-based set of relations. So Leroy Little Bear is a Blackfoot scholar from Alberta, a really brilliant thinker, and he got really interested as a Blackfoot person in kind of how quantum mechanics and Blackfoot knowledge and Blackfoot cosmologies or metaphysics are very similar in this idea that nothing is linear. There's no single points that you can pull out of the fabric of reality, that everything is interconnected. And what Leroy Little Bear has said for a very long time is Indigenous peoples in the prairies are wave-based. And we could argue that a lot of non-Western practices are wave-based, that everything is interconnected, it influences one another, it's not linear. The world is made up of relations and consequences for our actions that are really immediate and intimate. And so on the prairies, my nation, the Red River Métis, we are interconnected with other Indigenous nations on the plains through these wave-based relations. And one of the ways that manifests is that we were in a treaty called the Nehiopwat, or the Iron Confederacy, and we worked together to sort of support one another's sovereignties, and it was a political and military alliance. And in fact, my nation took up armed resistance to the state twice, once in 1869, 1870, when Britain sold, well, the Hudson's Bay Company sold the Northwest to Canada for like £100. And then also in 1885, when Canada didn't live up to the commitments it made after we took up arms against them the first time. And in that second one, the Nehiopwat Alliance came together, and Cree and Nakota peoples joined us in that armed resistance. And Canada was very brutal in how it ended our resistance. So I don't believe in reconciling to Canada. I don't think Canada has proved itself to be a worthy partner yet. I think that it still has not attended to its violences here or abroad. So to give just a bit of an example of that interconnection of Indigenous struggle in Canada with global anti-imperialist struggle, one of our leaders, Louis Riel, who's seen as sort of like the political and intellectual heart of our nation, he was trained as a lawyer. He was Indigenous. He was a member, was sort of connected to various families on the plains. And when Britain and the new nation of Canada started to continue to violate, but like ramp up the violation of our sovereignties, because they decided that they didn't want to use us simply as labor to sort of move the economic benefits of the fur trade from Canada to Europe. We were no longer useful to them as laborers. All that was useful to them was the land that we possessed as Indigenous nations. And so they started to try clearing us out of the way. And Louis Riel rose up with other Métis people against Canada when it tried to do this. And so the second time we rose up, in 1885, Riel found himself at the front lines of this resistance and was in a tent. And he wrote this letter, and he found that the Irish World was one of the only newspapers that he trusted to actually accurately portray resistance to Britain. And so he published this letter to America in the Irish World. And for me, I sort of see this as his understanding that we're interconnected to anti-British imperialism globally. And so he talks about sort of how the lands are being cleared, and they're already in the clutches of English lords who have large herds of cattle grazing thereon, and the riches which these lands produce are drained out of the country and sent over to England to be consumed by a people that fatten on a system that pauperizes us. This wholesale robbery and burglary has been carried on and is still carried on with the connivance of accursed England. The result is extermination or slavery. Against this monstrous tyranny, we have been forced to rebel. It is not in human nature to quietly acquiesce in it. So, in their treatment of us, however, the behavior of the English is not singular. Follow those pirates the world over, and you will find that everywhere and at all times they adopt the same tactics and operate on the same thievish lines. And so I think that's really important to kind of pull out, because how European and North American anthropologists have portrayed us as Indigenous peoples, and especially the Métis, is they try to sort of like silo us and pretend that we were just these sort of entities that weren't interacting with one another and weren't interacting globally with other people who were resisting colonization. And they frame us as sort of these like pure vessels of, ecological thought and wisdom, but they don't like to touch on our sovereignty, our political resistance, our armed resistance. Those are kind of like uncomfortable conversations, but that's the beating heart of who my nation is. We are very proud that we stood up for our sovereignty and that we worked with other members of the Iron Confederacy to resist British and Canadian colonialism. So other nations also stood up to the state and to the crown and paid a heavy price for it. And so this is a common history across a lot of Indigenous peoples in what we call Canada today. But I want to just highlight that fact that Indigenous leaders in Canada in the past and present were and are thinking internationally and are aware of the impacts of European colonialism on other people's societies and places globally. And we ignore that at our peril. We forget our obligations to what Canada and Britain have done and are doing to peoples throughout the world today. We forget that wave-based nature of who we are. We forget the consequences of us not acting as good relatives. So the late Secwepemc leader, George Manuel, who was from central British Columbia, invites us to consider a fourth world paradigm, which actually was coined by Tanzanian High Commissioner to Canada in the 1970s, Mbutu Malando, who sort of talked about like when the peoples of the fourth world come together, that's when there will be like real transformation. So George Manuel takes this idea of the fourth world and talks about, the need for us to not collapse Indigenous and non-Western peoples into colonial domination. And I think that's really a part of where the real resistance to environmental destruction comes from as well. But actually, we have solidarities of anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance that we can build upon in that wave-based way. So I'm going to try and wrap this up and just thank you for listening. But George Manuel said in 1974, quote, "The fourth world is not even a destination. It's the right to travel freely, not only on our road, but in our own vehicles. Unilateral dependence can never be ended by a forced integration. Real integration can only be achieved through a voluntary partnership, and a partnership cannot be based on a tenant-landlord relationship." And that really resonates with what Louis Riel was saying a century before, that, British lords were coming and taking over the lands and benefiting from them at the great expense of Indigenous peoples on the plains. And that repeated itself throughout all of Canada as Canada was surveyed and turned into sort of plots of land that could be mined, that could be turned into agriculture for settlers, that could be turned into cities that pushed Indigenous peoples to the margins in our own homelands. So how does Buddhism fit into all of this? Going back to how Vine Deloria had wanted to write a book about Indigenous metaphysics in the US and Canada, and then thinking through the metaphysics of other peoples around the globe, I've really been thinking about what would that book have looked like if he could have written it, because he touched on little bits of sort of that resonance through his career, but he didn't ever get to fully flesh it out. And so I've been reading Thich Nhat Hanh, which started a few years ago when a Thich Nhat Hanh book popped up in our little free library right outside my door a few days after my uncle passed away, and it felt like it was a sign from him. So I picked that book up, and then through the wonderful opportunity of getting to co-think with Siddharth on some of these issues, Siddharth has also encouraged me to take that analysis even deeper and read more Thich Nhat Hanh. So what I find really interesting, and this is just one example, there's so many other metaphysics we could be looking at and thinking through and considering across diverse communities around the globe. And I don't mean this in like a naive or superficial way. I mean, like really taking seriously the lives that people are living, the obligations that people have to our various homelands, and what it looks like to live in deep, deep obligation and an understanding of the consequences of our actions, not only on our immediate selves and our immediate surrounds, but on the entire set of existence that we all occupy and co-create. So what I find really cool about Thich Nhat Hanh is that a lot of his concepts are so immediately recognizable from like a Plains Indigenous perspective. So Cree, sort of Cree concepts like Wokotowin, which is the interrelation of everything and that understanding that everything intimately interacts. And then Siddharth mentioned Eugene Richard Atleo, or Umik, who's a New Channel philosopher and brilliant thinker here on the West Coast where I live, from here on the West Coast. He talks about Sawak, which is a New Channel concept of oneness. Everything is one. And that's really resonant with various iterations of Buddhism. So Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of interbeing, non-linearity, and non-possession really stand out. And so I'm just going to finish with these three sort of thoughts that I pulled from different parts of Thich Nhat Hanh's body of work. So the first is, my actions are my only true belongings. So just that reminder that it doesn't, as James Baldwin once said, like, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. Western society is really focused on what it says and saying it's doing good work, but we know from just the impacts that it has on the world that that doesn't hold in a lot of the cases that they're claiming. So my actions are my only true belongings. The second one is, the past is a ghost. The future is also a ghost. So that call to really focus on my actions in this moment, in the present, understanding that they have consequences for myself and others. And then something I've really struggled with, because I've been working in the like climate movement since my early 20s, and I'm 42. I'm an old lady. But really that call to do the internal work and the external work at the same time, that if I'm not doing work on myself and really ensuring that I'm holding myself to a sense of integrity and obligation, and just really understanding that my actions have impacts on others, then that isn't going to, my external work isn't going to have the benefits that it needs to. So the final one I'll leave us with is, touching reality deeply, knowing what is going on inside and outside of ourselves is the way to liberate ourselves from suffering that is caused by wrong perceptions. So I'm going to end there. Just thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Um, wow, so thank you very much. I think what you brought was special on many accounts, but perhaps most of all, what resonates with me right now is, in the fast-paced global environmental discourse, I think one also forgets that um, changing the world or saving the world, but for whom? And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
usually include everybody. So um, yeah, so Zoe and I are now going to ask each other one question and respond to pick up from themes in our presentations. And then we're going to conclude with a short poem. So we'll keep this brief because we're already at the hour. So do you want to go first? Shall I go first in asking?
Um, why don't I ask you first?
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So my question to you is, how has your engagement with Buddhism informed your mathematical work?
Ah, I think if I were to give a really honest answer, I would have to start with a really short critique of Buddhism and meditation, not as things in themselves, but as the way that one can relate to them. And what I found is, there's no teaching or practice which cannot subtly be co-opted by the mind that still tries to control or still tries to possess. And I noticed that for a lot of my engagement with Buddhism has been a daily meditation practice, and I would notice how for many years it was almost a way to distance myself from feeling things. Um, and so I think what meditation can do and what Buddhism can do is point you towards those things that you already know in yourself to be true. Um, so I think how one relates to meditation and to Buddhism is really important. Um, I think it has deeply informed my mathematical practice in some ways that I'm aware of, probably in many ways that I'm not. And maybe it's a lifetime's journey of realizing the layers of resonance. But I suppose a couple of things that I'll quickly mention. One is that during my PhD, it was a totally unexpected metamorphosis of disciplines. First year in maths, second year in ecology, third year in geography, fourth year taking classes in anthropology, finally writing a concluding chapter with an epilogue on Buddhist teachings. And I think it's, you know, all these conversations that we're having about transforming or just kind of becoming aware of maybe extractive or violent relationships, however subtle. How do you actually do the work of letting those shackles go and opening to um, a more loving or freer way of being? And I think the the practice of meditation has been really important for noticing how, even in academic work, particularly in navigating interdisciplinary spaces, when coming across ideas, theories, concepts that feel unfamiliar, I think fear can actually lurk at those boundaries. And fear, I think, is so much more often actually about the unknown than about danger. And so I think having a meditation practice where, and Buddhist teachings, I think, help with this, to be with that, to find a skillful way of being with the fear, and to realize that maybe there's more that lies on the other side of it. Um, yeah, and also I think realizing how maths is so much more rich and diverse than I think I ever realized practicing in the maths department. And I loved studying maths, and there are so many mathematicians that I love, and I really enjoyed working here. But it was only when I left the department and I was no longer doing maths just with mathematicians in a maths building, almost like having my own self image reflected back to me, that I got to find how there were depths to maths that I didn't really know was possible, but it was drawn out by kind of other ways of thinking and working with people in other disciplines. And so I think fundamentally the meditation practice has been about noticing when I push up against things that I'm like, oh, it has to be this way, or this is just the way things are, or this is what a PhD is about, or this is, this is what you have to do in your postdoctorate, etc. And just having the space to ask, is that really so? Does it have to be that way? Um, so I think that's how I found my engagement with Buddhism and meditation to really help in my engagement with maths and with academic work more generally. Okay. Uh, Now, the question that a friend of mine asked me to ask you, as a white European woman who deeply appreciates the wisdom and insight of Indigenous knowledge, I often grapple with my own positionality and role in relation to it. In your opinion, how can non-Indigenous people and scholars like me engage with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge keepers in ways that are supportive without being appropriative?
That's a great question. And as I've said before, I can only speak as an Indigenous person from the Red River Métis homeland in the prairies in Canada. I can't speak for other peoples at all, and I never would want to. I can't even speak for my own nation. We're a very robust government, and if I said something that harmed our sovereignty, they would let me know. um, but I think there are really amazing and vibrant, robust bodies of work that diverse Indigenous peoples have created. And I know the concept of indigeneity is itself so complicated, because it has been denied to lots of people, especially throughout the global South, who have not been kind of afforded kind of access to this space of, sort of like global Indigenous rights and things like that. So I want to be really careful about even just talking about Indigenous rights is complicated. But I like to think of like displaced and dispossessed people in general. And that's something that applies to a lot of diverse people around the planet who've been impacted by historical imperialisms and like neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. Um, Look for the work that people are writing that is explicitly being shared for public consumption. So there's a difference between kind of like the British anthropologists going and like extracting knowledge directly from a group of people so that they can own it and sort of say, I discovered that Indigenous people think this. I think the shift is read what people are writing about their own experiences. And so in North America, we have a really robust critical Indigenous studies discipline. And that's where Vine Deloria kind of like one of the founders of that. And, communities throughout every part of the globe have those disciplines and traditions and political movements where people are explaining their experiences to the world and doing it in a way where it's pretty clear to tell like when someone's doing it in a way that is explicitly like, please read this. This is our manifesto, or like I want you to read this. This is our story, versus the stuff that's been produced by people who've gone in sort of surreptitiously and extracted it for their own ends. And so, I guess as a reader, it's about how do you kind of discern when something's been done with autonomy versus when something's been done kind of extractively, and there's no clear line sometimes about that. So I know that's not a full answer, but I think I guess I can encourage like settler scholars in North America and European scholars in Europe, people who belong to sort of like the elite or powerful parts of a society, to really think about what are the stories people are telling about ourselves or themselves, and how can I kind of take my ego out of reading that and just really listen to what people have to say about their experiences, their knowledge. That's kind of my answer. It'll probably change the next time you ask me, but yeah.
Thank you, Zoe. Should we conclude with the poem?
There's so many
Okay.
good questions. I don't, how much time do we have? Have we gone over? Or,
By about 10 minutes, but then there'll be a short break and then there'll be plenty of time for a Q&A because it goes
oh,
until the hour.
okay, there's lots of great questions. So I'd be happy
Okay,
to tackle
great.
those we can. Yeah.
Have you got the text of the poem at hand?
Yeah, I'll pull it up. Go ahead.
Okay, this is a poem by Rumi called The Guest House, and we chose it as an invitation to do the work of attending to inner and outer worlds together. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. The dark thought, oh, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. They may be clearing you out for some new delight.
The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's take a short break and then we can come back for the questions. Okay, it looks like we've got lots of questions. Um, Matilda, would you like to pick pick a pick a few that we can answer? Or Zoe, if you want to choose some from the Q&A section.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many.
Well,
And
pick
yeah,
one that calls
which is
pick
good.
one that calls to you.
Yeah. There's a one that I hear about climate change mitigation.
Are you happy to read out the question?
Yeah, I have lost it. It was at the top there. Uh, but I think, okay, so maybe we could kind of combine some of them. Um,
Hmm.
uh, because quite a few are kind of curious about how do we actually like concretely address these issues now that we've described the metaphysics of them and
Mm.
the sort of that high, I don't know, that slightly more abstract set of relations. How do you like uh, concretely address climate change, taking non-Western and or Indigenous peoples' practices into account, while also confronting like the just sheer violence and destruction of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism altogether. And that answer is going to look so different depending on where you are. So I think one of the first lessons I take from critical Indigenous studies in North America is every place is distinct in that we have specific relationships to place that we can't map onto other places. And so, really, first and foremost, like really tending to what people who are familiar with the landscape have to say about it and looking at the practices that people have employed for lifetimes or generations or millennia even, because a lot of the answers that we're turning to solve climate crises here in Canada is suddenly scientists are saying, oh, people here on the West Coast have been had clam gardens for 15,000 years. Maybe there's something we can learn about how they navigated climate change in that time that could give us insights into how to navigate those things now. Or, a lot of that sort of stuff is coming to light now that, oh, actually, we should talk to the people who've been tending to this landscape for a really long time. And so I think part of it is really paying attention to those local practices that people carry out. And those can be on the scale of like 50 years to 50,000 years, depending on where you are. And so, but first and foremost, like for me in Canada, that's the starting point is asking what do local peoples do right now that is beneficial to the landscape? What would it take to center that as a response? And often that means like a legal change in who has authority to enter or be on land, because in a lot of cases the state has claimed that it has either fee simple rights to a place, and Indigenous peoples have not been allowed to go and tend to those places, or it just straight up doesn't acknowledge Indigenous sovereignties. And so it makes it really hard for communities to determine what activities happen there. Um, yeah. And then, this one's a bit controversial, but for some communities, the answer is to have Indigenous or local controlled um, economic development. And that's not the answer that you're supposed to offer because it's not the like environmentalist sort of branded, North American environmentalist response. But I'll give an example just really quickly. The Red River Métis, we harvest fish from Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg alongside First Nations in the area. We have really intimate knowledge of the health of those fish, but the body that controls it is a crown corporation that is like one of the most mismanaged crown corporations in Canada. Like the auditor general has had to come in and just excoriating reviews of the financial management by the arm's length board set up by the Canadian government. First Nations and Métis want to take our control over that freshwater fish harvesting back. And we argue that, but then settlers say, oh, well, then you're just assimilating yourselves. You're just harvesting in a capitalist sense. And we're saying, no, it's more nuanced than that. When we harvest them, we have knowledge about where they've been, how they've been distributed, the health of them that goes much deeper than the settlers who came in the 1870s. And so those are sort of sometimes nuanced conversations because they don't adhere to that kind of ecological Indian idea that Indigenous people are just supposed to be separate and outside of markets and economies. But of course, we're all in economies. We all have to generate kind of income and money somehow in this current world. And also, we fish to eat. So I don't think I'm giving a clear answer, but I think it depends on the place and the people, the sets of relations we have. And listening to people, people are the best experts of their own experience in a particular place.
Two things that I could add to that. One is that um, I would agree with particularly what Zoe says about the diversity or variation and what that can look like for different people in different places. I think that I think that depending on who you are and what your talents and interests and gifts are, I think it'll look different for everybody. I suppose two ways in which I've tried to practically address this, and I mean, I have to say, I couldn't separate the practical and the metaphysical, because the metaphysical things we've been talking about um, are a lot about, I think, how you live day-to-day life and the choices that you make. But I think the two things that I've tried to do, one is actually to read and cite Indigenous scholarship. So, as somebody who lives in the UK, my ancestors are from India, and I go to India every year. But the UK is, I think, of any place, it's the most that's my home. And so I'm not coming into immediate direct contacts all the time with these issues in a very visceral way. Um, and there's also it comes from a place of privilege as well. But I think I do think reading and when you read something that's unfamiliar from a different way of thinking or a different country or a different time, to as Zoe said, to listen, because um, I think you can learn almost more when you read a text, um, more about it alongside just the content, but also looking at how you react to it and how you respond to it. And I think reading a text is a really good practice in trying to become cultivating a more open mind. But then also, um, I've been it's a project that hasn't started yet, but I'm hopefully in the coming year or years going to work with a project with some indigenous nations on the Pacific Northwest coast on I think it's either clam. I think it is related to clam birds. Um, on writing some mathematical models for helping to manage those clam beds, um, but really thinking through how to ground those in a kind of an indigenous ontology, and going deeply enough into how those models are made to be aware of whether or not they're kind of importing lots of assumptions that may not be in service to what they're going to be used for. So I suppose for me, that's kind of how I've tried to put my skills in service to um, addressing this on a practical level. But that's obviously particular to me.
Yeah. And like political activism looks different every place that we are too. Like I spent my 20s hanging out with anarchists and protesting and like taught a session at a Greenpeace anti-tar sands camp where I told them, like, before you do anything, you have to make amends for the impact that Greenpeace had on Indigenous people in the 70s when they fought for the banning of the seal hunt. If anyone in the room has access to like streaming, there's a really good film called Angry Inuk by Alethea Arnakak Baril, which is a beautiful film about how Inuit were impacted by animal rights activists from the global north, um, and the work that Inuit have had to do to reclaim their relationship to their own harvesting grounds, while also dealing with just the incredibly fast impacts of climate change in the Arctic and Canada. So there's also like just like straight up political activism. And that film is really beautiful to watch too, because Inuit in the film go to the European Parliament to sort of make their case that your decisions about what is environmental activism have had just unbelievable impacts on us as a people. So yeah, also just like troublemaking, good trouble, like John Lewis argued for, refusing things that harm local people's rights.
Okay, let's take another question. Um,
Humza had a really good question that I can answer really quickly, which is, can we reimagine capitalism outside of ownership? I don't know if we can reimagine capitalism outside of ownership, but I do think that we have so many models of economic relations that don't require that possession and accumulation. And so there's like so many economic models before sort of Europe created the version of capitalism that we have right now, which of course is founded on enslavement of African peoples and just the like wholesale theft of lands throughout the Americas and Africa and the globe entirely. And and just like the violence that Europe enacted against China and other Asian countries, like this, we could. There are ways that we can relate that don't require that domination and control. I just don't know how we manifest it collectively. I think that's where that practical and metaphysical are really hard to work through. Because how do you get 8 billion people to kind of collectively refuse a structure that's harming the vast majority of us? I don't know. Um, I think maybe we're going to see with the US, like, what does the end of a certain kind of imperialism look like in our lifetimes? I don't know. So I don't know, Humza, if that answers your question. I think we can. I think it's very possible. Capitalism is just one wave of many that has manifested for humans.
there's a question here by by Sophie Burgess, which um, they say, I understand that this may seem procedural and therefore slightly against the point, but but is there a list of basic questions that one can ask themselves when embarking upon their research that would encourage the integration of these lessons and this open-ended thinking? Asking as a European who has had a typical Euro-US introduction to science. Um, the first couple of things that come to my mind, and again, this is a this is part of who I am and the way that I engage with things, is again with reading and reflecting. And there's a piece written by somebody called called Natural and Indigenous Sciences Reflections on an Attempt to Collaborate. And I
Mm.
read it and I just thought it was so beautiful. It's one of the readings, suggested readings for this lecture. And she describes how, so her PhD, so she was part in the biology department and part in the anthropology department. And her PhD, she set out to do like co-produce some ecological models with the Sami. And it was just one challenge after another that she had no preparation how to face or how to address. And it's a beautiful paper that kind of comes out of the end of her PhD of turning all of those things that were difficult and could be seen as obstructions to her scientific research actually into invitations for learning and doing things differently. So that's a paper that might resonate with some of what you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And just to sort of jump in, and what you said was perfect. But also, like, Vine Deloria thought about this a lot. And he argued in Power and Place, which you can find online for free. I mean, I want his estate to get the royalties, but if you don't have access, if you look up Power and Place, Daniel Wildcat PDF, it is online. And archive.org also has a lot of his books on there too. You can probably go to that Oceans of PDF too. I'm a big advocate for if you can't access something through paid means, read Indigenous scholars however you can access them. Anyways, he talks about the need for West, and I know we have to be careful about those categories of Western. They're complicated, and where we put the determinate boundaries around it is complicated. But when he was talking, he was explicitly talking about like people whose thought, logics, and action are based on an ontology coming out of Europe that viewed the world as something that it could possess and accumulate and extract from. And in the science that came from that world, he talks about how that science asks, like how and like what's going on, but doesn't ask why. Whereas the metaphysics of a lot of diverse people around the planet ask that why question. And so, one thing that you could add to kind of your work is becoming comfortable with asking why, and also becoming comfortable with possibly the why being something that doesn't feel scientific. And so, things that might have a spiritual component or an indeterminacy or are just straight up mystery. and and so and physics can't explain quantum mechanics. Like they know that it produces the most accurate calculations that have ever been seen in Western science, but physicists themselves do not agree on what is happening when between measurements of phenomena. And so I think that's also like becoming comfortable with that as Siddharth talked about in your talk, like the not knowing. That's a really hard thing to do when you've been trained in Western science, and I trained in biology, so like I totally it's a journey. But yeah, starting with that openness to asking why, even if it's a mystery. These are really good questions.
Hmm.
I like this question by Alvina. Is it okay if I pull it up? It's about the
Yeah,
internal.
go
Okay,
for it.
so the one, Alvina, I don't know how to pull it up, but Alvina asked, you spoke about the call to do internal as well as external work. I observed the tactics of the European Enlightenment and white possession rely hugely on dissociating from the internal world and focusing on controlling the external world. In hope of further resisting this harmful modus operandi, my question is, what does doing internal work mean to you in practice? How do you combine the physical and the spiritual in terms of internal work? So for me, I get messages. I don't know how to explain it, and I don't like how much to share in a public forum. But like for me, a lot of the internal work comes from like explicit guidance from some other entity that's telling me when I'm screwing up, like very explicitly. And I can think of a few examples where like maybe I didn't honor my relations the way I should have, and like literally like feeling like divine intervention or spiritual intervention sort of saying like this is unacceptable, you have to change the way you're behaving. Sometimes in like sometimes it can be softer terms and like dreams that are oh, I have something to think about. Or other times when I think when they know that I really have abandoned my obligations as a Red River Métis person, or I'm not honoring my internation diplomatic obligations to like where I live today, which is on Snuneymuxw territory on Vancouver Island, or if I'm screwing up in some way, they're not shy of letting me know. And it's that kind of listening that's sort of hard to talk about in a settler context in Canada, because that's immediately dismissed as sort of, oh, you're just making that up, or that's not tangible. But for me, it's very tangible. Like when you wake up with your heart racing and someone or some entity has communicated to you really clearly, like that's not going to fly, or in more other experiences of like, here's exactly what needs to happen. So for me, the internal work is a bit of that. And then also physical people in my life telling me when I'm screwing up. I'm very lucky to have people in my life who are not shy of telling me if I need to change my behavior to be in better reciprocal relations. And so those are those really uncomfortable things where it's not flowery, it's not metaphorical, it's like very deliberate, like please stop, or have you considered this, or and I think I'll just end with, I found the two places that were the hardest to get a read on, you know those kind of like straightforward conversations, which are really normal in Red River Métis context. Like we are very blunt, we're very sarcastic, we can be sarcastic, we're very blunt. Like we literally took up arms against the state twice in a 15-year period. Like we don't mince words. But I found being in, when I did my PhD in Scotland and when I lived in Ottawa, which is heavily influenced by sort of like a British ethic, like a very British way of being, British settler way of being. And people in both those contexts, I found people didn't like being forthright, didn't like being kind of direct and blunt, at least in kind of like professional contexts. And those were the hardest to navigate because it was really hard. You had to trust your gut, but also you had to do a lot of reading of people to figure out when they were displeased, and it was exhausting. And so the internal work for me is listening when they're coming through spiritually or like what people are telling me, and then also just like following the precepts of our governance traditions that tell us sort of like how to behave, and you know but it also helps when other people can be, and it depends. I know it's cultural, right? Like I'm not saying that you have to always be forthright and sarcastic like a Red River Métis person, but that work kind of collides, the internal and the external. And then if you're in a space where you can't, it's like frowned upon to have discussions about the internal and the external work, then it's extra hard. So I don't know if that helps, but for me, it's kind of just ongoing work constantly.
Oh, wow, there are so many good questions. So, um, I'm kind of intrigued by this question on ecological modeling and AI.
Okay.
And, and I don't know if, I mean, I don't actually think about AI that much, but um, I think it's a really interesting question. So Emily says, it's difficult to ignore the fact that AI will be brought forth as a key tool in ecology and broader work on the environment. Do you have any thoughts on the challenges or opportunities that this juncture offers to incorporate more diverse knowledges into the way we train and develop this technology? Or are they fundamentally incompatible given their epistemological foundation? What you got?
Well, I am not technologically knowledgeable of AI, other than understanding the very basics of how like computing came about, and sort of like that logic of yes, no, zero, one that is at the heart of our current kind of systems. Uh, I think that what makes me nervous about AI is the work that people have done, particularly in the US. So I've forgotten her name, but the incredible programmer who quit Google in protest over its racist practices, whose name has completely escaped me. And then there's really like Ruha Benjamin and Simone Brown, like really brilliant scholars in the US who've kind of looked at the racism at the heart of current, like Silicon Valley, and how current tech giants are operating. And so my fear with AI is just that, yeah, it has trained. And oh, my student Fatia Warsami wrote this beautiful master's thesis that she defended this summer, looking at how technologies of surveillance were being used to further surveil Black and Indigenous people in community, like social housing in Ottawa. And so that's a really like she does an incredible job, kind of like an overview of the racism at the heart of how that sort of technology operates. And so my fear is drawing on all of those thinkers who've kind of already pointed out that the current system is inherently racist. The AI as it currently operates has just baked all of those things into its algorithms, has baked it into sort of like the questions it asks about the world, and then how it trains, and what it trains things on, and then of course like how people's art and intellectual property has been used without permission to train these different systems. And so there are really cool Indigenous led projects that are kind of reshaping that. So there's a group at Concordia in Montreal led by Jason Lewis, who had a huge, like $31 million grant looking at sort of Indigenous perspectives on AI. My aunt is part of a group called the Indigenous Matriarchs for Media, and they also do some really creative work around Indigenous relationships to AI and different technologies. Then I guess like the other question is just the ecological impact of AI right now. Like, is there a way for us to develop these machine learning systems and these sort of like processes so that they don't use the amount of energy and water they currently do, and whose energy and like whose homelands are being impacted by that? So that's just my layperson. I don't think that they have to be into like they don't have to be automatically anathema to one another. Indigenous and like other metaphysical approaches don't have to be anathema to technology. Like we've all used technology since the dawn of humans figuring out how to use different implements and tools. But um, it's the things that are baked into the current structures that make them like reiterate that violence, and that's what makes me. So I actually have a ban on chat gpt in my courses for the environmental concern, and then the reiterating of those racist algorithms at the heart of the current systems. But if that were to change, I would be open to a different relationship with it.
The only thing that I could think of to add to that is it's I I get the impression that a lot of the discourse around AI, um, there's a slight kind of limitless feel to it, like the possibilities are infinite. Um, but I feel like there's so much depth to human knowledge and to human wisdom and human ways of being. And I somehow just feel like there's the d- there are depths of being in the world that kind of don't open up to you if you don't have some degree of patience or letting go of control or letting go of wanting to possess. And so I don't personally feel concerned about, and I say this because I hear a lot of people who do feel concerned about it. I don't personally feel concerned about um, AI matching human intelligence because I kind of feel like the the deeper that one goes into knowledge and being in the world, the more things like ambition and control kind of have to fall away. Um, Maybe that's a difficult thing to communicate here, but anyway, that came to my mind.
Yeah. I do think we're getting close to the hour. So should we do one more question?
Let's do one more question.
Okay. I'll let you choose because I'm wordy. So you pick one.
No, no, I feel like I'm learning so much. Um, there are two that kind of feel like they're calling. But yes, oh, and Samya talks about the Chipka movement. Yes, I think Sunderlal Bahuguna, whom I think led that, I think that's an amazing example of Indigenous ontologies and the environment. Um,
There's one that has 5 votes. Or go ahead. Go ahead.
the one that I felt was most calling actually was the by Pablo
Okay.
saying, if you're happy to have a go at this, and I will too. In my professional experience, I found, well, thanks to your kind words, Pablo. And Pablo says, in my professional experience, I've encountered challenges in incorporating these principles into my work and life due to misperceptions caused by
Mhm.
cultural and social influences. This has hindered the positive and transformational impacts that could have been achieved. Therefore, I would like to inquire about effective and actionable strategies for influencing others to align with metaphysical values and tenets beyond personal efforts. I could have a go, but
Sure.
I suppose what comes to my mind is ultimately I can never influence another person by trying to get them to do something, but that I have to embody it. But it is amazing where if you embody if you embody a different way of being and a different way of thinking, um, then somebody who is presented with that can be kind of startled out of thinking that their habitual way of relating or being in the world is kind of an inevitable reality. So I think it is important to find ways of um, not so much um, influencing others to change in the way that I think, but somehow touching people in a way that helps them to wake up to who they are and what they've got to bring into the world. And I suppose one of the things that I like about some of the Buddhist texts that I've read is that the kind of the fundamental layer of being human is not original sin or something like that, but it's an understanding that the base state of being of the mind is luminous, it's compassionate, and all of the behaviors and ways of speaking and acting that are harmful, it's almost like murkiness that clouds that luminosity. So I think it's almost not so much about finding a method and doing this to kind of become a better person in some way, but almost about, well, as Rumi would say, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you've built against it. So I think that
Mm.
sense of making space for yourself and letting old ways of being that maybe are no longer serving you slowly play out. And I think if you can find a way to hold space for others to do that, that's one of the most powerful ways for people to find their own truth, because truth is what sets you free.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think if I can just add to that beautiful and
Yeah,
eloquent answer that you gave, sort of concretely in the work that I'm doing in the academy, but also in my community, like not my Indigenous community, my middle class settler neighborhood that I live in. I think there's like value in being really committed to trying not to move from a place of ego. And like I have to check that every day, and I have to really let go of needing praise or recognition for a lot of things, and realizing like, no, my goal is that collectively we have to find a way to address these common challenges we're facing together. And it makes such a difference. Like my current workplace is so amazing. I'm in an Indigenous studies department. Each one of us represents a different nation or society from across the country, and also the US as well. And what I find is the humility um, of my colleagues when we collectively sort of set aside our egos. It it makes such a difference in how we collectively come to kind of like solutions to problems. And so I'm so lucky right now to be in a space where people have set aside their egos. Like it's unbelievable in the academy to experience that. And I'm like, I don't want to jinx it. um, but that experience has been really transformative for me to sort of see like, okay, if a group of people collectively say like, this isn't about me, and then like just commit to it, even on a small scale of running a department, like it has tangible impacts. And so I'm trying to carry that into other parts of my life too, and sort of like my political engagements of like, I don't need recognition. I want to know that I'm having an impact that is benefiting others. And so I don't know if you can take anything from that, but that's been my personal little transformative experience.
Well, shall we end there? It's yeah. Well, thank you all so much for attending, and Zoe, thank you so much for coming. I feel like I've learned so much from you in this talk.
Likewise, yes, thank you for the invitation. And what an incredible group that we've gotten to engage with today. Thank you
Yeah,
to Hilda and Rebecca as well. Yeah, I hope you have, wherever you are in the world, whatever time of day or night it is, I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your time.
thank you. It's dinner time here, so I'm looking forward to that.
Lunchtime here.
Well, bon appetit, and we'll catch up soon.